let's set up a situation here that needs a practical solution. I am an average middle market manufacturer somewhere in the United States, and I'm interested in lowering my costs. And then I'd love along the way to become more carbon neutral. Okay. How can I do both of those? Okay. So let's think about that a little bit. So if you do some research, the average bill, the electricity bill that an average manufacturer in the United States pays, $6 million a year is a good average, okay, as an estimate, all right? If you back into how many total gigawatt hours that is in the entire year, it's about 60 gigawatt hours. And the price point on that underneath is about 10 cents per kilowatt hour, which is an average, and it varies throughout the day and throughout regions, okay? So we're buying about 60 gigawatt hours per year. That's quite a bit, okay? That means at any given moment during the year, I'm probably needing about 20 megawatts of power to run my facility. Let me put that in perspective for you. That would be a large data center, about 50,000 servers. That's about the need of a large data center, 20 megawatts, or a large manufacturing facility that has some robotics and automation built in, all right? So that's our situation. I want to lower costs and I want to be more carbon neutral. Okay, so let's look at actions. Here's some news. So we started off by saying, hey, most of this rise of regionalization has become well-known in the press, somewhat cliche. Well, here's something not a lot of folks are focused on or talking about, okay? 1 decade ago, the capital costs to set up a solar array were about 3.5 times what they are today. Solar used to be really expensive. And the people that set up solar arrays to power their house or their business, they were doing it for the good of the planet, but it was more expensive. Okay, it would have been cheaper for them to buy electricity off the grid. Okay, that's changed. All right, so our customer here, our example, this factory can spend $20 million and build enough solar arrays in order to power 20 megawatts. So it's easy to remember, 1 megawatt, 1 million in CapEx. Like I said, that used to be $3 to $4 million as recently as 10 years ago. So solar's a lot cheaper. That's great. Okay. Well, let's take it a step further. So what that means then, as a just hardcore business person, I can spend that $6 million and just pay it to the utility, to the grid every year in perpetuity, and I will suffer the outages. I will suffer the variability. Okay. Or I can spend that $20 million of CapEx one time, and then all of a sudden I can self-power when the sun is shining. All right, 20 megawatts right there, ready to go. It lasts for 25 years. Obviously, there's maintenance along the way. But here's the other piece of breaking news, okay? The government incentives have changed the equation here dramatically, and we're going to break it down for you in detail, all right? The good news is on that $20 million of capital expense to self-power your solar array, Cherry Bekaert has a full team in-house that can help you in detail estimate every incentive you're eligible for, understand it, obviously do the tax return, but then target other grants, loans, and programs that you might not even know about. So at a very high level, I'm the business person just setting up the situation, roughly half of that capital expense, okay, about $10 million, that's a targeted total subsidy in roughly the first year that can come back to you. And that sounds amazing, almost too good to be true. So we're going to get into the details here. And then on top of that immediate subsidy, you still get to depreciate your equipment over time, which is a tax shield, and you get your energy savings. So it's a triple win. So I'll pass it over to Ron, and he's going to take it a step deeper here.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you for our listeners. It's good to be back with you all. But when you think about the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, and we talk about the various credits and subsidies, as well as loans and grants what we're dealing with at a very high level is Section 48 and Section 45 of the Internal Revenue Code. Now, we're going to focus our case study today in regards to Section 48. So as a reminder of what communicated last week, Section 48 is what is referred to as an investment tax credit. That's where the manufacturing facility is being onshored. We're building a new facility and we've decided that we want to put solar array to it, or we are going to put solar array on an existing facility. And so it's an investment tax credit, and then we're making an investment in the underlying solar array coupled with all the installation cost. Section 45, as a reminder, is what is referred to as the production tax credit. So solar and Section 48 have been in the statute for some time. IRA reinstated that percentage to 30%, but it also gave us some what are called bonus credits, which we'll talk about in this example. And remember that Section 45 deals with production. So that is a credit that is applicable over a year's, as opposed to the ITC being kind of a one and done, an original investment tax credit. And what has happened in production tax credits is that where we saw basically turbines, wind turbines specifically. But what has happened underneath the Inflation Reduction Act, it has really spawned what Jason has hit on a couple times around what's called the 45Q credit, which is the carbon sequestration credit, as well as a 45V clean hydrogen credit, as well as a number of 45Z, as it's referred to, clean fuel credits. So before we get in the case example, we can assist you as part of Cherry Bekaert's energy team, which I'm fortunate enough to lead. We can model not only the advanced manufacturing credits, but we can model for you the advanced manufacturing production tax credits, as well as really any of the alternative fuel credits, the carbon sequestration credits that I mentioned, renewable energy credits, energy investment credits, alternative fuel, clean electricity production credits, clean fuel credits. So that's where that $600 billion of funding comes in, on top of what we'll talk in a later slide is what's called the Department of Energy Loan Program Office. So let's go through the example. If we can move it on the slide, that'd be great. So again, we're dealing with Section 48, and there's really two types of incentives that are immediately benefited by purchasing, installing, investing in a solar array. So Jason's done a great job in kind of outlining the fact pattern for us. We're going to spend $20 million, really broken down between our solar system of 18 million that's going to generate our 20 megawatts. But in our case, we've made the decision as well to have a battery pack. So we're going to store those kilowatt hours that we're generating in our solar array. So Section 45 tells us that we receive a 30% credit. And again, that was moved from 26%. So now we're looking at a 30% credit really through 2032, as long as the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. So what's the first benefit we receive? 30% to the 18 million is a $5.4 million investment tax credit on our solar system. A new credit in the statute underneath the Inflation Reduction Act is another 30% credit, but that's where we are going to store our kilowatt hours. So we now have a battery pack, and we receive a battery pack credit of 30%, and that's going to generate another $600,000, or the 30% times the $2 million. Now, there were bonus credits that are in the statute, as I mentioned. And so specifically, when we think about the bonus credits, as they're referred to, or stackable credits, there is a provision in there which says around site selection, if I'm building my facility, if I'm onshoring, or I might already be in what's referred to as a energy community, which is really defined as a brownfield site. So these are areas that were recently closed from a coal facility or an adjoining tract with respect to what's called the energy community. And what do I receive? I receive a 10% credit bonus, if you will. So that's my $1.8 million you see in our slide. So the total amount of federal credits by my investment of the $20 million is 7.8 million. But it gets better because states also have adopted the solar array credit or the investment tax credits. So depending on where we want to ultimately select our onshoring site or where our facility is located, we want to do the analysis at the state credit level. So we chose South Carolina, which has a maximum cap, which some states have unlimited. But in this case, the South Carolina credit is 25%, but it is in fact capped at 2.5 million. To just illustrate, you have to evaluate the states, and that's where our site selection as well as our modeling services come into bear. So summing the $7 million, 7.8, along with the 2.5, because that 2.5 is going to be obviously a credit against any type of income franchise tax in South Carolina. We're at spending $20 million of hard cost, and we've received immediately upon the interconnection or the place in service date, $10.3 million of credits. So again, this is a credit, and we receive it upon what's called interconnection and grid connection. Now, if you recall last week, I talked about provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act around what are referred to as direct pay or transferability. And we can talk about that later, but I would remind you that underneath the Inflation Reduction Act, depending upon the specifics, the federal government will write you a check. In this case, we don't want that because we don't qualify. Or if you have excess credits, you may sell those credits to a third party for cash. And then, of course, there's usually a discount to that. But let's walk away. We spent $20 million. We've received $10.3 million of credits that can be monetized against federal and state taxes. But it gets better. We look at that facility and we say, well, we spent $20 million and we've now received 10.3 million, or at the federal level, 7.8. Well, of course, I have what is referred to as depreciation, and I also apply the bonus depreciation rules to the energy system. But note that you must reduce your basis of the asset when we're talking about depreciation by half of your Section 48 credit. So we're going to reduce that by the 3.9 million, which gets us down to a basis of 16.1 million. Now, we're placing this in service in 2023. And what the rules now, effective January 1, 2023, tell us is that our bonus depreciation is no longer 100%, but it's 80%. So I immediately get to take my $16.1 million basis and immediately expense $12.9 million underneath the bonus depreciation rules of 168K. And then the balance of what I did not bonus is 5-year property, just as the solar array is 5-year property. And I receive another $640,000 because it's 20% in year one. So if I sum that, my total energy depreciation benefit in year one, as I place it in service or interconnected, is $6.1 million. So the combination of those two is $16.4 million of immediate benefit. Now, notice that I took a tax benefit attributable to my depreciation at 45%. So, of course, that's a deduction. So I tax affected it to get to my 6.1 million. But the reality is, in year one, I've spent over a 2 to maybe 3 year period, depending on the construction of the facility, I get a benefit of $16.4 million immediately out of the $20 million. But it gets better yet. So let's look at the next slide. So there's two sources to Jason's comment from a CEO or a CFO perspective as, well, what does this mean to me in quote savings when I think about my electricity costs? And Jason painted the picture of an average cost of $6 million. So let's walk through our energy arbitrage opportunity by now having solar. So as we talked about the overall kilowatt arbitrage on a 20 million CapEx, we're driving a 20 megawatt system. That's 60 gigawatts per year. So if we didn't do anything, we would be spending $6 million every year, as Jason highlighted in our fact pattern, for our energy costs. But now we've done something, and then we're now going to look at, well, gee, I've already purchased my solar array for $20 million and received all the benefits from credit and depreciation. And of course, I have a maintenance cost, and the average maintenance cost on a solar array is usually about 2%. And therefore, we estimated it was about $1.2 million when you think about maintenance and then the grid. And so I have immediately arbitraged in real cash savings by utilizing a solar versus interconnecting or really buying power from the grid of immediately $4.8 million. Now, the next slide you may or may not be familiar with. And Jason, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so we had a question from the audience or a comment. Lou Bim pointed out correctly, 6 million doesn't go to zero. And he was exactly right. And we weren't trying to suggest that. So that 1.2 million is a little bit of a catch-all for grid connection, some solar maintenance, and then there might be times whenever we purchase from the grid. So it basically gets cut by 4/5. But Lou Bim, you're exactly right. And that's the placeholder. And that number varies upon where you are in geography and your power purchase agreement that you have set up with the utility. Thanks, Ron.
And just as a point of information on the question is that if you go out and kind of do some data searches, the average cost is about 2 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's how we calculated the 1.2 million from that standpoint. But it also gets better from the standpoint that some of you may be familiar with what is referred to as peak shaving. And so what is peak shaving? And as the graph illustrates, if you are buying during the peak periods, that cost of a kilowatt hour is on average, depending on the state, the geography, probably about 25 cents. Now, the definition of a peak period is from 5 a.m. in the morning to 10 p.m. at night. Non-peak is 10 p.m. at night to 5 a.m. the following morning. Well, most of our manufacturers, obviously, depending on shifts, are running 2 shifts, and we're in that 5 a.m. in the morning to 10 p.m. at night. So what this graph illustrates very succinctly is the ability to peak shave, where the green is now we're using our own kilowatt hours, where as opposed to if we weren't in a solar array, we would be paying that utility during those peak hours. Now, if you calculate this from the standpoint of our overall savings out of the 4.8 million, it usually gets to about $1.4 million, where we're just shaving the peak depending upon what is the power consumption during your peak periods. And that's a variable that we can model as well. But peak shaving through purchase power agreements have been in place for a number of years, because obviously the grid is getting the higher the pull on the grid, the higher the cost of the kilowatt, almost similar to an Uber, depending upon the traffic patterns. So now let's move to the estimating the lifetime battery peak shaving value. So Jason, take us through that slide.
Thanks, Ron. Okay, so physically what we're doing here is we're setting up a set of batteries in an array, and we're going to power them up when the sun is shining and get all those kilowatt hours ready to go. And then when the sun is not shining, or the grid is just too expensive, or the grid's down, power outage, we have our batteries. Okay, so they're backup. Okay, in data centers, this is non-negotiable. You have to have it. It's part of full-time availability. And then for other types of factories, it just depends on what you need. All right. So let's go ahead and talk about this. So an average battery array, it usually gets warranted for about 1,000 to 2,000 cycles before it deteriorates in terms of being able to hold its charge. Let's just use 1,000 cycles to be conservative. All right. And then let's go back to Ron's example where that peak price from the grid, it was touching 25 cents. Now, we were talking to a large data center in California last week, and they were sharing with us that their peak charges are now over 90 cents per kilowatt hour. So almost 4 times the savings that we're using here for this example. Okay. So when you're computing your savings, you know, it's how many cycles is a battery going to last times the savings per kilowatt hour times the size of our battery pack. Well, we're spending $2 million in this example for an average manufacturer trying to figure this out. All right. What that essentially comes out to in the math is that we are going to give ourselves $2 million of energy savings using our batteries versus the alternative, which would be buying from the grid, especially at these peak prices. It adds up fast, especially for critical infrastructure and electricity intensive operations. Okay, so that's $2 million of real energy savings versus the alternative. All right, and then on top of that, you get the investment credits that Ron just talked about, which was about $600,000 on the 2 million. You get that back right away. And then furthermore, you still get to depreciate your expense through the income statement, which gives you all the tax benefits. Okay. So for spending $2 million on a battery array with this set of facts, you can see this quickly has a very quick payback and provides real benefits. And then there's the soft benefit. And that is, if you're running critical infrastructure, having a battery array in your back pocket in case there's a big outage or the sun's not shining, there's obviously operational benefits there for yourself to turn on that power switch. All right. So let's put it all together here. And this is somewhat structured like a cash flow statement. You can imagine that this would be the building blocks to a discounted cash flow model that the finance department would build. Okay. So what happens immediately? Well, we have to spend the $20 million on CapEx, okay, solar and battery, like we talked about. And that's going to be cash out of our pocket, or we'll arrange financing for that. All right. And then we have to get to work. Okay. There are supply chain challenges in this ecosystem. Okay. So that doesn't happen right away, getting all that equipment in and getting it manufactured and set up. Okay. There's time. But once we get it set up and we connect to the grid, okay, Ron walked us all through it. We got 10.3 back, and that was either direct pay or the transferability of credits to other people where we can sell them and monetize that. So at a very high level, about half of our CapEx comes back to us in the first year or so. It just depends on how long it takes to get the work done. Well, that's interesting. Over half comes back. Okay. And then secondly, when we file our first tax filing after we're set up, okay, Ron walked us through the accelerated depreciation expense of 13.5 million, okay, which can yield about $6 million in additional after-tax profits. But here's the kicker, okay? There have to be profits in order to shield them, all right? So let's think about our case study. Our case study is a profitable U.S. mid-market manufacturer that's looking to both lower costs and go carbon neutral. Okay, we're assuming that manufacturer, it's profitable. It has profits. So whenever we start this project up, that accelerated depreciation expense will offset taxable income and therefore reduce our tax liability and put that cash in our pockets, that additional 6 million. Okay. So then the question is, who would this not really be applicable for? All right. Let's say that we become entrepreneurs and we want to set up a solar array and just sell energy back to the grid or to customers, but we're going to be an entrepreneur, a solar entrepreneur. All right. In those cases, you're probably not going to be profitable, okay, for very long until some time goes by. So you'd have to wait till you're profitable in order to get this value, the 6 million. All right. But for our case study, that means $16.4 million of cash comes back to us in the first year or two or so as these things come together. All right. And then you have that raw energy savings, 4.8 million, but that could change with different fact patterns. But that's the 6 million you were spending for the utility versus the 1.2 now. All right. And then over the lifetime of this project, 20, 25 years, we have that peak shaving, which can be extremely powerful to avoid grid charges. That was about 2 million over the lifetime. All right. Now, it depends what discount rate your finance department wants to use. But if you throw this into a DCF, a discounted cash flow model, roughly the present value benefits of this versus the very simple alternative of just buying electricity from the utility, the present value benefits easily are north of $40 million in present value dollars. So meaningful, tangible benefit with this set of facts, okay? And we're being very careful to set that up because it doesn't apply to everybody. So that CFO, you can do both. You can be more carbon neutral, you can lower costs, and you can become more carbon neutral and tell that story to the capital markets in a very detailed way, which is what people are looking for now. And we'll all be rewarded for that.